On an ordinary evening in July 1997, two sisters left home and never returned. Within hours, fear spread through their family. Every unanswered phone call, every passing minute, deepened a nightmare that would soon grip the entire Philippines. As the search intensified, hope slowly gave way to heartbreak, and a local missing persons case transformed into one of the nation's most controversial criminal investigations. The disappearance of Marie Joy and Jacqueline Chiong devastated those closest to them. Parents searched desperately for answers, while investigators raced to uncover what had happened. Before long, arrests were made, witnesses came forward, and prosecutors presented a version of events they believed explained the tragedy. Years later, the courts upheld convictions, seemingly bringing the case to a legal conclusion. Yet the story refused to end. Long after the verdicts, journalists, legal observers, and members of the public continued asking difficult questions. Some argued that parts of the forensic evidence appeared incomplete. Others questioned whether the timeline presented during the investigation fit every known fact. These concerns did not erase the court's ruling, but they ensured the debate would continue. This episode is not about rewriting history or declaring guilt or innocence. Instead, it carefully separates documented court findings from disputed claims, examining where the evidence appears clear, where uncertainty remains, and why decades later the Chiong Sisters case continues to divide opinion unlike almost any other criminal case in Philippine history. This case continues to attract attention because of the questions surrounding the investigation, the evidence, and the justice system. The story remains a subject of discussion because different people continue to examine the facts from different perspectives. Understanding the case requires separating verified court findings from claims that remain disputed. It requires looking carefully at what is documented, what was argued, and what questions continue to remain. Decades later, the Chiong Sisters case remains one of the Philippines' most controversial criminal investigations, with debates that continue to this day.
As investigators worked to piece together the events of that night, the case gathered momentum with remarkable speed. According to court records, police focused on several suspects after receiving information that they believed connected them to the disappearance. Police focused on several suspects after receiving information. Detectives interviewed witnesses, compared statements, and gradually assembled a timeline that prosecutors would later present as the backbone of their case. At the center of that narrative was eyewitness testimony. The prosecution argued that witness accounts placed key individuals at crucial locations and described a sequence of events that led from the sisters' disappearance to the crimes that followed. Prosecutors maintained that these testimonies, viewed together rather than in isolation, formed a consistent picture of what had happened. Physical evidence was also introduced during the trial. According to the prosecution, forensic findings and recovered evidence supported important portions of the witness accounts, reinforcing their theory that the crime unfolded in a specific order. Investigators argued that each piece, while perhaps limited on its own, gained significance when combined with the broader body of evidence. By the time the case reached the courtroom, prosecutors believed they had constructed a coherent narrative that connected the suspects, the witnesses, and the available physical evidence into a single chain of events. Even so, much of that chain depended on the credibility of testimonial evidence. As the trial progressed, the defense would argue that if those accounts contained serious weaknesses or inconsistencies, the prosecution's carefully built timeline could begin to unravel.
As the prosecution presented its reconstruction of the crime, The defense began pulling at the threads that held it together. Rather than offering a completely different story, defense attorneys focused on whether the official timeline could withstand close examination. They argued that if even one critical link failed, the entire sequence deserved renewed scrutiny. According to court proceedings, the defense questioned the logistics of how the alleged events unfolded. They challenged the estimated travel times and the movements attributed to the accused. They questioned whether certain actions could realistically have occurred within the prosecution's proposed timeframe. In their view, some portions of the narrative required assumptions that were not conclusively supported by the available evidence. The defense also examined witness testimony in detail. They highlighted inconsistencies between statements and questioned whether memories remained reliable after repeated interviews. The defense argued that several accounts evolved over time, raising concerns about how accurately witnesses remembered what they had actually observed. Prosecutors, however, maintained that minor inconsistencies were natural and did not undermine the essential facts of the case. Many of these arguments were presented directly before the courts, where judges evaluated their significance alongside the prosecution's evidence. Other questions gained wider attention only after the trial, as journalists, legal commentators, and members of the public revisited the case. Those continuing discussions gradually shifted attention toward one issue that remained especially controversial. The biggest remaining question was whether the forensic evidence truly matched the story the prosecution had asked the court to believe. As public attention shifted from dramatic courtroom testimony to the physical evidence itself, the case entered a far more complicated territory. Unlike eyewitness accounts, forensic evidence is often viewed as objective, something capable of confirming or contradicting a narrative. In this case, however, its interpretation became one of the most debated aspects of the investigation. According to the prosecution, the physical evidence presented at trial supported key elements of its reconstruction of the crime. Prosecutors argued that the available forensic findings, considered alongside witness testimony and other evidence, reinforced the sequence of events they had described. Rather than relying on a single decisive item, they urged the court to evaluate the evidence as a complete picture. Critics, however, argued that important questions remained unanswered. Some pointed to the limited forensic confirmation available for certain claims. Others questioned whether the physical evidence independently established every critical step in the prosecution's timeline. These concerns continued to fuel discussion long after the verdict. Legal commentators and those who closely examined the case continued debating what the forensic record actually demonstrated. It is important to distinguish uncertainty from proof. The absence of a particular type of forensic evidence does not automatically establish innocence, nor does it invalidate every other piece of evidence presented during a trial. Courts routinely consider testimonial, circumstantial, and physical evidence together rather than in isolation. Even so, some observers believed the forensic record was less definitive than public perception suggested. That continuing debate became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. The courtroom was left to weigh both the forensic evidence and the broader body of testimony. Ultimately, the central question remained whether the totality of the evidence met the legal standard required for conviction. Despite the lingering questions, the court now faced the challenge of deciding whether guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
Inside the courtroom, every detail was tested under intense scrutiny. What had begun as a heartbreaking investigation had become a legal contest where every statement, every timeline, and every piece of physical evidence carried enormous weight. The prosecution argued that although no single exhibit told the entire story, the combined evidence formed a convincing and consistent account of what had happened. Witness testimony remained the foundation of the prosecution's case. Prosecutors maintained that multiple accounts, supported by the available physical evidence and investigative findings, established a logical sequence that identified the accused and explained the crime. They urged the court to view the evidence collectively rather than focusing on isolated inconsistencies. The defense approached the case from a different direction. Instead of proving an alternative version of events, defense attorneys sought to demonstrate reasonable doubt. They questioned the reliability of key witnesses, highlighted discrepancies between statements, challenged aspects of the prosecution's timeline, and argued that the forensic evidence did not conclusively resolve those uncertainties. According to the defense, unanswered questions remained significant enough to prevent absolute certainty. The judges were ultimately tasked with weighing not only the evidence itself, but also the credibility of those who presented it. They considered whether inconsistencies reflected ordinary human memory or indicated deeper flaws in the prosecution's narrative, and whether the totality of the evidence met the legal standard required for conviction. The courtroom had reached its defining moment. Soon, the judges will decide whether the prosecution's case overcame every reasonable doubt, or whether the lingering questions carried enough weight to change the outcome forever. After months of testimony, evidence, and legal arguments, the courtroom finally reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. The court ruled that several of the accused were guilty, concluding that the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. According to the judgment, witness testimony, supporting evidence, and the consistency of the overall case formed the foundation of the convictions. For the victim's family, the verdict represented a long-awaited measure of justice after years of unimaginable loss. But the legal battle did not end with the trial. The defense quickly turned to the appeals process. Defense attorneys argued that important weaknesses remained in the evidence and asked higher courts to reconsider the convictions. After reviewing the complete record, the appellate courts upheld the convictions, leaving the original judgments in force. Yet outside the courtroom, another conversation continued to grow. Journalists and documentary filmmakers revisited the investigation, searching for answers that many believed remained unresolved. Legal experts and scholars debated whether the prosecution's timeline fully aligned with the available forensic evidence. Others questioned the reliability of key witness testimony, or argued that certain physical findings left important questions unanswered. None of these debates changed the legal outcome, but they ensured that public interest never disappeared. A criminal conviction reflects the court's decision under the law, while public opinion often continues evolving long after the judgment becomes final. That is why the Chiong Sisters case continues to attract attention decades later. The tragedy remains undisputed, while debate over aspects of the evidence continues. Legally, the convictions stand, yet in the court of public opinion, the conversation has never truly ended, leaving each new generation to ask the same difficult question. Were every one of the unanswered doubts ever fully resolved?
Decades have passed since the disappearance of the Chiong sisters, yet the case continues to challenge anyone willing to look beyond the headlines. Its story reminds us that criminal investigations rarely unfold with perfect clarity. Witnesses may remember the same event differently, making the search for truth more complicated than it first appears. Forensic evidence can answer important questions while still leaving others unresolved. In the end, courts must reach decisions based on the evidence presented through the legal process. The Chiong sisters case also highlights an important distinction between legal judgment and public discussion. A legally upheld conviction reflects the court's judgment after evaluating testimony, physical evidence, and the law. Public conversation, however, often continues long after the courtroom has reached its final decision. Many observers continue asking difficult questions, but responsible discussion should never replace verified facts with speculation. Looking back, the greatest tragedy has never changed. 2 young lives were lost, and a family endured unimaginable grief.
that human cost should never be overshadowed by debates over legal theories or differing interpretations of evidence. Perhaps that is why this case continues to resonate with every new generation that discovers its story. It encourages us to separate documented court findings from disputed claims and to recognize that truth demands careful examination. Whether someone accepts the court's conclusions or continues questioning parts of the investigation, the lasting lesson remains the same. Justice requires evidence, compassion, and an open but disciplined mind. That is why the Chiong Sisters case refuses to fade. Beyond the verdicts and the debates, it continues to remind us that justice is strongest when it is guided by facts, respect for evidence, and compassion for those whose lives were forever changed.